Hello and welcome, friends. Good evening. On behalf of Osana's Foundation, I would like to welcome to today's segment of Osana's Dialogues. We are going through a very interesting world. Yesterday, we had discussions on the current situation in West Asia, and we had some of the finest experts from Israel and UK to discuss the situation as it's emerging in West Asia. And today, we have another discussion on the fractured fault lines in West Asia. And we have a very special guest with us today, Dr. Daniel Benaim. Welcome, Dr. Daniel. So Dr. Daniel Benaim is an associate fellow at Middle East Institute, and he's a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Arabian Peninsula Affairs at the U.S. government and NSC Senior Director for Speechwriting and Strategic Initiatives and Special Assistant to the President. Dr. Daniel Benaim, it's a pleasure to have you with us today, and we look forward to a very engaging and enriching discussion. As you can see, Dr. Daniel has served as a Deputy Assistant Secretary General in the U.S. government. So he is someone who brings a very strong insider experience as well as a field experience. And we today will learn from the practitioner and a very strong theoretician both. So Dr. Daniel Benaim, I'll just, without wasting much time, I'll just straight away begin with my first question. No, it's an interview format, so first we'll address some very fundamental questions, and then we'll take questions from the audience also. So, I mean, how do you look at things in West Asia? The ceasefire has taken place, so there are many questions that are actually disturbing our mind, because we were not exactly prepared, for this 12-day short war. People were thinking of a regime change or a massive devastation, and this whole thing coming to such an abrupt end raises many questions. So how do you look at this?
Well, first of all, thank you very much, and thanks everybody. I appreciate the kind introduction. And having finished with a master's degree from the Fletcher School, I appreciate the academic promotion, but I think I'll have to refuse it. Look, it was only a month ago that President Trump traveled to the Gulf, armed with a series of business deals, bilateral agreements, and big ideas for artificial intelligence and the future. But even as we were kind of aiming for the Middle East of 2030, the Middle East of 1979 came roaring back in the form of Israeli-Iranian conflict that ultimately drew in the United States. Now, I think in some ways, even as we're going forward, we're still dealing with the legacy of the Iraq War, which was very formative for the last several American presidents and was very formative for President Trump, who was eager to end regional wars and not to get embroiled, and gave Israel a certain amount of freedom of maneuver, and then ultimately came to a point of reckoning where he felt that it was important that the United States finish the job. Now, finish the job in that case meant a very limited series of strikes and a very limited Iranian retaliation that we were able to weather. That was just enough for the Iranian government to come out and have the slenderest fig leaf, slenderest reed to declare victory in front of their own people, as the supreme leader did today. But where we are, I would say, is that the Iranian government, there's a lot of fighting in the American media about just how far back the nuclear program has been set by these strikes. And I think the honest truth is that it's too early to know, probably more than the critics say, and certainly less than the president says. But the bigger question really is, what do you do from here? You've set back the Iranian program militarily. You've taken steps that I think in some ways make diplomacy more difficult. As Iran was preparing twice to go negotiate, there were military surprises. I see a few different paths where things can go from here in terms of the Iran crisis, with very different implications, which is why I feel like the precise meaning of what's happened is hard to know. What I think we can be sure has happened is that since October 8th, really, 2023, Iran has kind of made a series of calculations that left it much weaker when it decided to instigate, enable, and then join that conflict between Israel and Hamas Iran lost its proxy in Lebanon. It lost its state proxy in Syria. It lost a chunk of its missile program and its military, and was exposed. All of its deterrent capacities were exposed one by one. Its proxy network, which was remarkably quiet during this war, its missile threat, which Israel has shown that it can weather, its deterrent capacity against U.S. bases, which I think the Gulf countries, that capacity remains, but Gulf countries, I think fairly wisely, have reached a détente of sorts with Iran that raises the diplomatic cost to Iran for striking those targets. You saw the president of Iran call the Emir of Qatar and apologize for striking Qatar, essentially express regret, which was an indication of the ways in which Iran had been boxed in to a certain extent by that détente. But looking ahead, I think there are really three paths that I could see Iran take that have three very different implications. Um, First, it is possible, I would say not probable, but certainly possible, that these strikes could help set the stage over time for diplomatic engagement between the United States and Iran, probably brokered by Gulf countries or others, that would lead to permanent restrictions or enduring restrictions on the nuclear program and allow us to deal with the loose ends of this nuclear program, including nuclear material enriched to 60%, centrifuges, various other elements that are out there, and even if damaged or disrupted, are probably not destroyed. And even if they're destroyed, they can probably be rebuilt. There's no happily ever after here in terms of a military option that with a night's bombing destroys a program that is a major national capability. So you could have diplomacy. It would require the United States to give Iran some ways to save face. Um, the administration seems to have decided that nuclear enrichment of any kind is off the table after having originally offered it, according to reports. So we'll have to see what inducements they're willing to offer to Iran to engage in such diplomacy. Iran may be totally unwilling because of its nationalism and pride after being struck by the United States and Israel to engage from what it might perceive as a position of weakness. But I think diplomacy remains the best path to deal with the nuclear program. The second path that I think you could see is drift. And President Trump seemed to be kind of cavalierly talking about the possibility of this or the risks when he was insinuating that they don't need a deal. They're not, and he's always negotiating and thinking about positioning. And I think that he's trying to signal that the United States is not desperate for a deal. A drift scenario would be the sites would remain damaged. The Iranians maybe wouldn't be in a rush to rebuild them. They wouldn't be in a rush to go for a breakout, but they also wouldn't quite be ready for diplomacy. And with aggressive monitoring, maybe the diplomatic option wanes behind the military and intelligence for a period of time. And the third option, which I think, unfortunately, is meaningfully possible, is that Iran decides over the coming months that the lesson of this time was that it needed a nuclear weapon like North Korea had, and that it should rush in secret to reconstitute a weapon. In which case, these very limited U.S. strikes might put us on a path to either a larger war or to the cascade of nuclear proliferation that we were seeking to avoid. So I think we're really, as much as we've spent 20 years negotiating and debating about in the United States whether to bomb their nuclear program or engage in diplomacy, I think that this actually resolved very little, as often the case with military force. So I'll stop there, and leave it open for the next question.
Thank you, thank you, Daniel. So my another question. Well, right now it seems that the U.S. seems to be basking in the moment of victory, particularly Mr. Donald Trump, and raising his voices in various platforms, craving for the Nobel Peace Prize, and also, I mean, we all get to hear these stories every day. But I mean, the question that arises in our minds is that why now? Iran has been building this nuclear project, for last several decades, and I guess ideally the U.S. and Israel should have done this long back. In fact, I've spoken to many strategic experts here also, and they share the same opinion that, I mean, this should have been done long back. But why now? We saw that on one hand, President Donald Trump was negotiating with the Iranians, and on the other hand, Israel launched that attack. Was it coordinated, or was it like, under some kind of the pressure from Jerusalem? I mean, that remains a little unclear.
I think you're exactly right that it remains unclear. And nobody looking at this process across 5 different U.S. presidencies would say that it was linear, let's say. I think in 2015, we achieved a diplomatic outcome that put meaningful restraints on the program for 10 and 15 years, and in some cases permanently. But President Trump withdrew from that agreement a few years later. And after that, Iran was able to really race to the nuclear threshold where they stayed in terms of nuclear enrichment. Nuclear weaponization is another story altogether, and there they were much further behind. I think in that time, when President Biden came back, there was an interest to reconstitute some kind of nuclear deal and find some way to extend those deadlines and sunset clauses, which were always the hardest part, toughest swallow for the United States of the deal. But that nuclear diplomacy never really materialized because Iran wasn't serious. I think in part because they knew that the political opposition could come back to power and simply sink a deal. Then you have the events after October 7th, the weakening of Hezbollah, whose missiles were really the major forward deterrent for Iran in the region, that were blocking, I think there were predictions and assessments about the number of casualties, Israeli casualties, American casualties, that would come from a military strike on Iran. Those assessments were very high. Part of that was because of Hezbollah's missiles, because of the proxy network that we expected would be in a mode of aggressive retaliation that stayed remarkably quiet, and because Iran had air defenses that were vaunted that would have to be defeated. So when in the year and a half before these strikes, you saw the Hezbollah missile threat defanged, you saw the Iranian air defenses stripped by Israel, Iran was really very exposed. That created a window of leverage. I would have liked to see that window of leverage really used for diplomacy, and I think that was President Trump's plan as well. There's also a window because we have until October under the UN Security Council resolution that helped implement the Iran deal to snap back the nuclear sanctions on Iran, the international nuclear sanctions, if Iran is deemed to be out of compliance. Europe, which remains, the European countries, France and England, which remain party to the deal, have the ability to do that, what they call snapback, by October. So for a variety of reasons, really, and also it's the first year of the presidential term before any congressional elections or anything like that. For a variety of reasons, I think there was a compelling argument to call the question in the United States of whether diplomacy could work, which seemed to be what President Trump was doing. I think Israel, seeing that the United States was calling the question of whether diplomacy might work, felt that it had a window to act, to shape that situation. Now, I don't know exactly what was said between the president and the prime minister behind closed doors. We'll never know. I think had the president very forcefully urged the prime minister not to engage, it's quite possible that that would have been the outcome. And that suggests to me that some message was given in between green and red. There I'm speculating, and I want to be clear about that. I think that that Israel, having called the question, the president wanted to see how far they could get. He saw that they had a very successful military campaign and decapitation strikes, etc., and felt that it was, from where we stood, the best course was to use that unique American capabilities of a bomb and a bomber that was able to reach into the Bordeaux plant to a degree yet to be determined, and with a degree of success yet to be determined, but felt that there was a unique American capability that could help to end this, what he called the 12-day war. So I think the answer to why now is really the confluence of all of those factors for the United States, and then the fact that the United States and Iran were making such headway on the diplomatic side, or the possibility, let's say, of such headway over this time, I think helped Israel. And then you take on top of all of that, the fact that the IAEA report about suggested that Iran was in the process of dispersing its weapons, or excuse me, its centrifuges to more sites for enrichment. You take all of those things together, and I think you had a very potent mix that ultimately combusted, as you saw, and led us to this moment where, again, I think many problems were addressed and no problems were solved. And the full definition of these events, as has been said about the French Revolution and other things, it's too soon to tell. So back to you.
Thank you. Thank you. So regarding, I'm in agreement with you when you mentioned about, this diplomatic part. Definitely, I mean, Trump administration was waiting for the diplomacy to work successfully in this case. But I mean, my research mostly comes from terrorism and counterterrorism, and I have
Hmm.
met a lot of Shia leaders in Jammu and Kashmir who have a very strong penetration, deep, I would say, inroads in the Iranian setup. And what I gathered from my long conversations with them is that the hatred which prevails in the Iranian regime. I'm not talking about the people, but the regime. The hatred towards Israel, that comes primarily from religious reasons. And I mean, they don't have a territorial dispute. So it's a very clear-cut ideological religious line, that they have taken. And in that case, diplomacy can work. I mean, it may work perhaps as a very tactical, short-term solution. But once if they're capable, and if they're able to regroup and restructure, they are likely to come back. And with that, my question that I want to put across is that right now, Iran seems very weak. We saw that the Chinese never came to help them, Russians didn't come to help them, and I mean, they are in a very, very weak position. So why not go ahead to complete the mission? And that's finally the final piece can arrive only if there's a complete regime change. I mean, so why not go ahead? Why to leave it midway?
Yeah, well, first of all, great question. I think when it comes to the motivations of the Iranian regime, I do think that they want to expel the United States from the Middle East. They want to dominate, and for a variety of ideological and political reasons, they view Israel as an enemy. Now, they've been fighting essentially what they call a war between the wars with Israel for the last many years, a kind of gray zone war of assassinations and terrorism. And so, certainly seeing your scientists and others killed, there's real enmity that could be explained without ideology, but ideology is certainly a very potent factor. And when you talk about an 86-year-old religious supreme leader, I think you have a meld of religious ideology, personal attitudes, hyper, nationalism, and a kind of political equation where people don't really like the regime and don't want them in charge. And one of their best arguments is that they are able to resist the West, resist Israel, resist the outside world. That's about as good an argument as they have, all of which does make diplomacy hard. But they have done it before and taken that risk. Now, I think that you're right that the ideological core means they'll only ever go so far. They don't particularly want American products running around. The Ayatollah Khomeini said, this revolution wasn't over the price of watermelons.
Yes,
I
yeah,
think,
yeah,
they're not. It's not just a material rationalist neoliberal equation here. It's something much deeper and more profound. So I think that's right. Uh, uh, but I do think that they can negotiate anyway. You see, all sorts of ideologues reach all sorts of interesting contortions to stay in power and affect their national interests while they manage their politics and ideology. Ayatollah Khomeini, despite having hidden for the last week and nobody in the world coming to their defense, was out on TV saying, "We punched America in the jaw with these 14 missiles, 13 of which were intercepted, one of which landed in an unpopulated space." So I think ideology, yes, and perhaps that comes with a degree of flexibility that we shouldn't underestimate. However, regime change, which was your question, um, it's a really tempting equation in some ways to suggest bad regime causing problems, just change the regime. It's simple. There's nothing simple about this. You start with the array of forces inside Iran. There is no force inside Iran and no particularly organized force outside Iran from truly outside the power structure of the state that is ready to do what happened in Syria, where you had Jolani, uh, Ahmed Ashara, come in and have a fully formed kind of government in exile waiting. And even there, you had tremendous problems because the major resistance had ties over time to Al Qaeda and was a U.S. designated terrorist. Here, you have no group poised to come in and rule the country. And you're not talking about a country the size of Kosovo, and you're not talking about a country the size of Iraq. You're talking about a country 3.5 times the size of Iraq, which is massive. So perhaps you can kill the leaders of the country, as Israel, it seems, was tempted to do, but there will be other leaders behind them who will then be radicalized and less tethered in many ways to the to whatever constraints have existed, because they would know that the United States was unconstrained as well, or Israel was unconstrained. So you could potentially have a coup where the Revolutionary Guard or others take over, but to really discard the regime, the only way that I can see to do that over time is with a degree of military involvement on the ground that is, I think, in this last 20 years plus of post-Iraq war U.S. politics, untenable for us. Israel is a country that is, in terms of its military eligible population, is something like 1/15 of the size of Iran. They're not ready to do it. We're not ready to do it. So the only people who are really well positioned to do this are the Iranian people. But they, unfortunately, the balance of force is in favor of the government, which has shown that every few years that it's willing to kill and imprison and repress and coerce to hold on to its power. It could happen. I think one day it probably will happen because of the illegitimacy of the regime with its people. But it's just extraordinarily difficult to manufacture it from afar. And when you take the lessons of regime change wars of the past 25 years in the Middle East for the United States, where it led to either chaos or worse, I don't think there's any appetite, despite President Trump's tweeting, to launch to make a decision to launch a war of regime change, of real regime change.
Thank you, Daniel. But after Donald Trump's great lunch meeting with field or rather Field Marshal Mr. Asim Munir, we thought that the Americans are going to repeat the Afghan experiment in Iran. But unfortunately, our hopes are dashed. So moving back to my next question, I mean, should we conclude that these strikes were like one-off random American intervention in the Middle East, and America is again going back to its declared aim of withdrawing from the global conflicts, or is there a possibility of repetition of the American strikes in the future if it is found that the nuclear capabilities were not dismantled?
Yeah, it's the right question, because I mean, I think there was a rush to claim complete obliteration, but we don't actually know what happened. I think the bigger question President Trump seemed to signal in his speech the night of the strikes, and since, that if the threat persists, and I took that to mean if Iran continues either to attack the United States forces or to reconstitute its nuclear program and move forward in a way that was threatening, that the U.S. was willing to do additional strikes. I don't think that the U.S. will probably kind of say, "Up, we missed a spot," and go back in, absent a real provocation. This was costly to the president, who his political base is really split between kind of nationalists and hawks and a more isolationist wing, who numerically are maybe smaller but are pretty influential. Um, I think there's a political cost to this for the president, and I think that he may do that if he feels that that's what's necessary to prevent a nuclear-armed Iran. But I think there's a bar of activity. As to your question, I think it's a very interesting one. It's possible that this marked the beginning of a willingness to use limited U.S. force in more different ways, as he did against the Houthis, as he did against Iran. Certainly, I think they're trying to bound those efforts. You can see a wariness of kind of long-term entanglements in the decision to reach a ceasefire with the Houthis that in some ways was quite underwhelming when it came to preventing the Houthis from attacking Israel, or even maritime, ensuring maritime traffic could pass. So I do think that there is a willingness to use force and to kind of brandish the stick, but it's coupled with a real reticence about entanglement. What that means in the long term for the Middle East, I'm not sure. The last several American presidents have done their best to rebalance U.S. forces to the Asia-Pacific theater and have made major headway, but have made less headway in reducing the footprint in the Middle East. And perhaps that's an indication that it's still needed there.
Thank you. So moving on to my next question. We've seen that the Arabs have seen very advanced capabilities of the Israeli intelligence and the army, and also the recent attacks. So, given that the situation is now, in a way, at least for the time being, is turning favorable for Israel and the U.S., can we expect that IMAC is finally going to see the daylight?
That's a great question. Gosh, I love IMEC. We worked on it a lot. I believe in it. I think it will have to happen in phases because the big hole at the center of a lot of this is Gaza. And my hope is that Gaza will, that this ceasefire in Iran will create momentum and political space for Israel and Hamas to actually come together and reach some kind of agreement that stops the fighting in Gaza. President Trump inherited a ceasefire, it lapsed, and we've now had several months of intense fighting and all kinds of plans for the future of Gaza. The problem is then you go to the Gulf states, and on the phone of every one of their citizens is the story each morning about how many people have died in Gaza the night before. It is extremely difficult for them as a matter of public opinion and strategy to really move ahead on these issues while Israel is at war in Gaza. So I think that probably the first part of IMEC that makes the most sense is the Gulf India part. I think the Gulf Israel part will make sense. The logic will probably hold at some point. It hasn't been a priority of the United States in dealing with these issues on Gaza or to really normalize Gulf Saudi-Israeli relations as much as I thought it might be, because Gaza just wasn't ripe, and I think Saudi Arabia in many ways it moved further away, and normalization is a bit adrift right now in my view. But it could certainly come back. But I think working on each of these connective pieces and one in turn, one at a time, makes a lot of sense, and then eventually you'll get the full vision of going back to the era of Alexander when Greece and India were connected with everybody in between. Only this time I think it'll bypass Persia, the best I can tell.
Yeah, thank you. So I have two more questions pertaining to the West Asia, and then I'll come back to the India part because a lot of our audience is also waiting for the India part. So my next question, we've seen, I know I'm also keeping a close watch on Turkey, and we see that Turkey is emerging as a very, I would say, as a new leader or a proto caliphate, empire kind of mindset that's prevailing in the Turkish, establishment, and they have this pan-Turkic ambitions in Central Asia. Maybe, with this, I would say the decline of Iran, the Sunni extremist forces will get stronger in Turkey. What's the American, I would say, longer term approach for Turkey? Because we recently saw that Donald Trump went to Syria and, he shook hands with the wanted terrorist, Mr. Julani. I mean, that was quite an embarrassment.
Yeah.
So we wouldn't really have expected that. I know that in the past, Americans have, definitely done a great deal of work with a neighboring terror state, that's Pakistan. But going to Syria and just dealing with the Julani government. So what should we conclude? I mean, because even Israel will have to deal with the Syrian regime and the Turkish setup, because Erdogan seems to have very long-term ambitions. So what's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think Turkey is a dilemma for the United States. It's a NATO ally. It's a partner in many spheres, and but it also has a very different Middle East policy than the United States. I think that President Trump has a warm relationship with Erdogan, to everyone's sort of surprise and interest, and I think they're trying to use that constructively. I think that when it comes to Syria, the United States, this wasn't our chosen path to the fall of Assad. I think most Americans had more or less given up on the fact that the Assad regime was going to fall. When this happened, we had an overture from Ahmed Ashara. He was basically became the leader of the country, was willing to work with us on counterterrorism issues and fight ISIS, which was a surprise to us. Really disavowed his past promises, was despite the fact that he had a lot of militia and jihadist groups in his coalition, which was very vexing, really was working personally to tamp down and stop intercommunal violence in the country. So I think we're figuring out what to make of him. Each month that goes by, he seems to be cementing this impression of having engaged in reform. He has a very complicated political balancing act. He has militia constituencies. He lacks command and control over some of his groups. I think President Trump made what I think was a wise decision to lift sanctions on Syria, which would have made it impossible for a coherent government to take shape. We have a lot of geopolitical interest there. It was quite interesting that Syria was essentially on the side of Israel, on the side of the U.S. in this war, and did not condemn the Israeli strikes in any way, despite having its own border dispute with Israel. So, and did more, I think, probably than that. That's quite interesting. We have a Russian base in Syria that the United States, I think, should be quite concerned about. I'm not sure how concerned this administration is to see that removed, but I think there's an opportunity there. And frankly, this was an Iranian bulwark in the Middle East. And having a consolidated state that is anti-Iranian is enormously useful to the United States. So I think that led us to test whether Syria could stabilize. Now, one of the interesting things about Syria is that I think it was treated initially, because of the way that this government fell and because of the way the militia had held power, as a kind of Turkish cat's paw, Turkish proxy. But what I've seen over time is that I'm not sure Turkey is really calling the shots with Ashara. I think they're an influential player. I think Saudi Arabia is an influential player, and there are other influential players, Qatar, and others. But Ashara is kind of charting his own path, and that's sometimes frustrating to the Turks. And I think certainly, like when it comes to the Kurdish question inside the country, I hope that he charts his own path alongside the Turks to a much more peaceful absorption of that area over time as part of a political compact. But I certainly understand the apprehension given his past and some of his fellow travelers. But I think this is an opportunity for the United States to forge a relationship with the state of Syria that I think was too good to pass up. Turkey, it's a balancing act. Erdogan certainly has his ties into Hamas. I hope that at this moment they can be used to pursue a common interest in a ceasefire that addresses the threat on the ground sufficient so that we don't see another lapse back into fighting, which means probably serious curbs and some departures from Hamas, from Gaza, to allow that kind of open wound to close, which I think will have salutary benefits for all the regional integration efforts that we're talking about over time. The Saudis have dug in a little bit on the Palestinian issue. That will have to work itself out over time and work its way through, and Israeli leaders will have to decide what they can live with. But that, I think, is more or less where we are. I think a weakened Iran does create regional initiative and space for other countries in the region, for Israel, which has revealed itself not only capable but willing to be a military heavyweight and a diplomatic heavyweight, for the Gulf states, which are economic heavyweights and strategic heavyweights, and for Turkey as well. But we'll have to see how each of them use that space and whether it creates new fault lines beyond a kind of polarized two-way polarization that we saw between an Iran-backed axis and another axis. But it's a less polarized Middle East. The Gulf is already much less polarized than it was, both internally and in terms of the U.S. Iran and Israel-Iran tensions. They've kind of charted their own path. So there's probably more strategic autonomy within the Middle East is coming, even if the U.S. and Israel reveal the kind of hegemonic weight.
Thank you. Another question that we saw that what happened in Nagorno-Karabakh and the regime change in Syria spoke volumes about the limits of the Russian influence. And also in the recent case, we saw that even China didn't do much to help the Iranians. But do you think that in the future, if this conflict escalates, do you perceive a bigger or rather deeper entanglement of the Chinese and Russians in this conflict, or once again they're going to just stay on the fringes?
Yeah, I mean, as we're learning in this moment, I think it's hard enough to predict the recent past, let alone predict the future. But I think that, look, one thing that the last 20 months of conflict in the Middle East have made clear is that for the moment, the United States really remains the unchallenged external power that's willing to invest diplomatically, militarily, strategically, and that the countries of the region look to. I think there is a role in the future. China will have a role. It just is too big a trading partner for some of that economic power not to translate into strategic power. Some of it already has, but in many ways that's a lagging indicator still of China's potential role in the region. They don't want a big strategic role. I remember this day when I was at the State Department, maybe over a year ago, when the Houthis had begun their campaign of piracy in the Red Sea, and you had a People's Liberation Army vessel that was ostensibly there to fight piracy under the old Somali pirate mission, that just sat and watched as the Houthis boarded, I think, like a Greek vessel, and harassed and threatened the crew, and did nothing to intervene or to stop the effort. So there's a limited ambition when it comes to what China is willing to do. That could change over time. It's been a big focus of the United States to keep Chinese military installations out of the Gulf, because I think it would complicate a lot of the other work that we do there, to have a major Chinese military presence there, and we've succeeded in that largely. So, despite low-level defense ties and cooperation and things like that, so I think we're a long ways off from that. It certainly could happen in the future, but the fact that they don't want it to happen and no one is really looking for it to happen means that that future is probably a ways off. Russia is a little bit different. Russia at the moment is really preoccupied with its own war. And you saw that in Nagorno-Karabakh, and you saw that in Syria when they looked around and there was just no cavalry coming for Assad from any direction. Not Hezbollah, not Russia, not Iran. It was striking to see the weakness of all of these forces at this particular moment converge in the collapse of this regime. So I do think that Russia has a military foothold still in Tartus, and I think that Ashara in Syria has kind of decided that while he's alienating Iran and navigating his path, he can't afford to really alienate Russia. I think perhaps the United States could have pushed a little harder on that to try to keep Russia out of the Mediterranean basin there. But maybe it was less of a threat, less of a perceived threat to this group of people, and just hard to move around and be nimble enough, quickly enough on Syria. Russia has a bigger historic military relationship with some of the countries in the region. Has sold air defenses to Iran, has sold low-level air defenses to the Gulf states in some cases. You could see those things flare up, but right now there's a giant sucking sound, which is Ukraine, and all the munitions, all the weaponry is heading from the Middle East to Russia, not from Russia to the Middle East at the moment, by and large. So you certainly could see that, and they talked a tough game, but I think what was revealing when the Iranians went to Russia was how little material support was really forthcoming. And so I think that for now, they too are focused elsewhere, and I don't expect them to be there now. But in 20 years, who can say? The United States has proven itself to be a very unpredictable actor on the world stage as well over these years, with shifts and reversals. And it's hard to predict that far out in terms of the U.S. role. But if the U.S. role is solid and steady, I think it will be a long time to come before there's a major Russian or Chinese military role in the Gulf, on either side of the Gulf.
Thank you. Thank you. So now let me bring you to a much quieter geography, that's South Asia. And my two questions are particularly regarding India. How do you look at India's role in West Asia, particularly amidst the current circumstances? And my second question, as Donald Trump also repeatedly said during his last tenure that Americans gave $33 billion in aid to Pakistan. But today we see once again, Americans cozying up with the terror sponsoring state called Pakistan. And, that's something which is very disappointing for India. Can you share your thoughts on these two things?
Sure. Well, I should say that I don't have a lot of qualified expertise on Pakistan. So I think you all could teach me more than I know. It might have been the fact that I stopped at my master's and did not become Dr. Daniel that will prevent me from answering your Pakistan questions in full. But when it comes to India and Southwest Asia, I think from the Gulf side of the water, it's a tremendous opportunity. It's a business opportunity. It's complementarity. It's kind of a strategic integration and trust that's been built up over time with the leaders in UAE and very warm relations with Qatar and Saudi as well. These things I think are extremely useful. In the administration where I served, we tried to work on a bunch of trilateral and four-way projects, not only IMEC, but I2U2. I don't know that these things have really continued uh, in the way that they could have, in part because of the war, in part because of political changes in the United States. But these ideas, investment in key sectors together, are really ripe and ready. And whether it's food, clean energy, um, including AI, where we're working on major deals with the Gulf. Are there interesting ways that we can work together to invest and help build up AI partnerships? Um, there's a lot to do. So the Gulf countries, I think, see India really as a rising power in its own right, as a rising center of power, and as a place for great power cooperation with the United States. So where the three of us can, or four of us or five of us in some cases, can work together to really create the kind of economic interconnectivity we want to see, to help be part of and profit from India's economic rise and help convert it into a strategic rise. So I do think there's tremendous complementarity there. I think India, looking at the Gulf uh, and looking at Iran, an Israel-Iran conflict or a Gulf-Iran conflict, which we didn't see, has a lot of different relationships that it has to juggle. And you have a lot of expatriate workers in a lot of different countries. I know you've written about this. And so I do think that it was both striking and probably positive that India didn't rush to join one bloc or another bloc in this war. Put you in a position to keep all of these burgeoning strategic relationships intact. Uh, but I think and hope that the future for India will really be uh, with the countries aligned with the United States in this region, um, even as you do port development and remittances and other things on both sides of the ledger. So I know from talking to Gulf states that they see enormous opportunity, and frankly, I think India is part of their equation for how it is that they look to build on the opportunities that are available in East Asia and in Asia and the Pacific Rim and the Indo-Pacific, as American strategists are fond of calling it, but not exclusively aligned with China. So their point to us is, yes, we're looking to Asia, we're looking to China, but also to Japan, Korea, India, and a slew of other relationships that will kind of create a multifaceted and sort of more balanced world of economic ties for UAE, for Saudi, for Qatar. So huge opportunity, great trilateral opportunities as well, and something that I hope continues across this administration, which I think has been more bilaterally focused and has removed some of the tools that we hope to use. But in other cases, they're working on building out development finance and other tools. So I think there's hope yet to see those efforts continue. I think the hardest part is bringing in Israel alongside the Arab states and making sure the Arab states are cooperating and not competing when it comes to some of these big plays. But this is still, I think, part of the wave of the future. And it's just a question of how quickly or how slow it comes.
Thank you, Daniel. So now I'll open the house for the Q&A, and we can take maximum 3 questions. I request all the participants to keep your questions very precise and short, and 3 questions. Whoever wants to ask the question, please, you can type your questions in the chat box, or you can unmute yourself and ask your question. Yeah, but please keep them short. No comments, and I would say your observations. Any question?
Have I talked you all into submission?
I guess you answered, most of our queries.
Hi,
I think Mr.
Abhinav,
Yes,
this
Rahul.
is Rahul.
Yes, Rahul. Yes.
Uh,
Please go ahead.
it's been wonderful listening to you today. It's been a very long time as well. Let me ask 2 questions very clearly. One is, we see that more than 3 years have passed since Russia invaded Ukraine. And on the other hand, we also notice that the US does strikes on Iran, and these are like off in a couple of days, and a ceasefire is called for. So my question is, how do you see the behavior of these two great states, the two great powers, uh, the Russia continuing to drag on with its war, and the USA strikes and declares a ceasefire? This was one. My second question is even smaller. Uh, Attacking the nuclear facilities, does it not kind of lead one into release of radiation, or the nuclear devices getting triggered off somewhere and leading into a bigger tragedy? Thanks.
So two great questions. I think in terms of the release of radiation, this is something that the U.S. military has been drilling against, and presumably the Israeli military as well, for a long time. It's a real issue, especially for plutonium plants. Uranium enrichment is a little bit easier to deal with the risks of, as far as I've been led to understand by non-proliferation experts in terms of the safety. There is a risk. People haven't detected additional radiation off of these sites to date, as far as I understand, and that's probably an indication of a great deal of care being put into avoiding it. As to your larger question, I do think it's apples versus oranges here, in the sense that Putin wrote a long essay, essentially going back through the history of Russia and Ukraine since Kievan Rus and before, 1,000 years ago, and arguing that Ukraine should be part of Russia. While the United States has lately found some creative new ways to get into territorial disputes with neighbors, none of these rise to the same level as that. We're not fighting an existential war for the identity of our country. We're fighting, I think, on the margins of what might be a vital national interest of preventing nuclear proliferation in the Middle East. But this is not something that is poised to come home to the United States immediately. So we're also fighting a war that we didn't start, or we're engaged in a military campaign that we didn't start, and we're engaging in it in a way that would allow us to end it. Whereas Russia, I think, is engaged in an open-ended military fight over what it considers to be an existential issue. I think, I guess, who am I to lecture Russia on that? But it certainly seems like they chose this war, and they chose it as a war of aggression and conquest, whatever their historic narrative. And that's why they were willing to absorb 1 million casualties to pursue it. But for the United States, I think a limited investment to achieve a limited outcome was a more appropriate, role here. It's true that Russia has proven willing to be very dogged in pursuit of, first the Syria campaign for years and then Ukraine. But it's also true that the world and the United States and others have imposed a major cost on Russia. And they've done it, frankly, without some of the things that people worried most about, which was this breaking of NATO or splintering of NATO, and without a WMD attack. So in that way, the United States pursued in both theaters a kind of limited policy that allowed us to meet core limited objectives of preventing the conquest of Ukraine without causing chaos, and of setting back Iran's nuclear program, maybe, and avoiding a wider spiraling of the war. So I do think you're seeing a United States that's using more limited means and ends, but also fighting a less existential dispute.
Thanks.
So I take a question from the chat. Abhinav, I think I've lost you here. What key lessons should we draw for long-term strategy in terms of reactive strategy? Look, I hope that they keep a focus on long-term strategy. I think this was a crisis, not of the United States making in particular, although I think when you look back to the fact that we had a diplomatic track and we ended it under President Trump in the first term, there's a way in which he's both the arsonist and the firefighter, as has been said. But I think that there is a proactive agenda for the United States in the Middle East that is incredibly important that we should keep faith with, and that has a few real components. Number one is, I think, the three deals that the negotiations that this president should keep focus on. One of which is an Iran nuclear deal, but the other one of which is normalization between Israel and Arab states that we shouldn't lose sight of, and the regional integration possibilities that would bring. And a third, I think, is ending the war in Gaza. Then you have consolidation of weak and fragile states, which is harder. And frankly, we've dismantled some of our best tools to do it in the midst of our domestic politics. But that includes Syria and other fragile states. But then really, I think President Trump on his trip was onto something when he talked about playing up U.S. business development in this region, U.S. tech engagement in this region, and basically a more economically engaged vision for what the United States can do. And frankly, I think that's not just a matter of business and GDP, it's a matter of strategic staying power and strategic competition with China. For the first time in a long time, after losing a lot of ground on 5G, we have the better product on AI, chips, data, and it's time for the United States to play offense and share that product around the world to the extent that we responsibly can, while protecting our own lead and protecting our security, and doing it responsibly to gain geostrategically from doing it. So I think you saw all that in that trip. That's a proactive, affirmative agenda for the region and of closer partnerships with some of the region's stable countries. It's very hard to do in the Middle East because there's often these crises that flare up and take you off course. But I do hope that we stick with that positive agenda.
Thank you, Daniel. So now we have about 3 to 4 questions, but I think we can just take like 2 questions. I'll try to combine 1 or 2 of them. So we have a question from Mr. Arun Anand. He's asking, how do you look at the possibility of the de-radicalization of Islamist forces in West Asia? Then maybe this can be combined with what Mr. Khwaja Danish Hamid wants to ask. He's asking that why do states based on Muslim Zionism, that's Pakistan, and Jewish Zionism, that's Israel, fail as democracy and democratic states?
Well, that last one is probably a book-length treatise, if not longer. You know, look, I think that Israel has to balance the fact that it's the world's only state that is homeland for the Jewish people and the political implications of that, with the fact that it has traditions of democracy and equal treatment that are very important to the United States and very important to many Israelis, and of the rule of law. That's an extremely difficult straddle because those are very real tensions. And they're very real tensions that each generation of Israeli leaders have had to deal with, and this generation does too. Strike their own balance between that religious national identity and what it means civically and strategically, and the desire to be a country of equal laws and coexistence and rule of law. I don't have a simple prescription for how to answer that, except to admire the problem and the dilemma that it poses for Israel, and to say that Israel has real choices when it comes to how it can continue to be both of those things and live those values. Your other question was about de-radicalization.
Yeah, of the Islamist
There's a real
forces
push
in
and
West
pull.
Asia.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a real push and pull going on right now. I think it's very important that you have leadership in places like Saudi Arabia that really are making a good faith effort to come to a new vision, a nationalist vision, a modern vision, a more cosmopolitan vision, a more tolerant vision, that have real buy-in and cachet in some cases with their people, and that are really trying to articulate a meaningful alternative within the Arab world. And frankly, beyond the Arab world, I think it's if Vision 2030 succeeds in Saudi Arabia, it'll have implications for even Iran, as people look across the water and say, why can't we have what they have? Which I think was unthinkable until recently as a question. But Saudi Arabia is now getting ready to pass Turkey when it comes to the percentage of women in the workforce, which is a truly remarkable change. You know, they're heading into the mid-30s and 40s, which is what you get towards some of the other global South countries that don't have this religiously restricted history. So I think those changes are remarkable, and they are truly forces for de-radicalization in this region. On the other hand, I think conflicts like the Gaza war have the opposite effect, and you're already seeing some of that additional violence. I think efforts through programs like countering violent extremism have a mixed track record, but are worth some degree of investment, focused on these issues and focused on other groups of violent radicals. But I'm not sure I see this administration investing as much in those tools versus outsourcing some of this work to partners in the region and just being willing to accept a degree of radicalization on the ground, basically because they view it as an inevitable byproduct of a chaotic region. So I think you're seeing the next generation of radicalism forming over Gaza, and it's a real problem, and includes in the United States, where we've seen violent incidents due to the Gaza war. But I also think you're seeing a clear alternative that is indigenous to the Middle East itself, emerging, that is maybe more potent than some that have emerged before.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Daniel. And my apologies to the participants. I cannot take any more questions because I think we've already run past our time. We requested Dr. Daniel to join us for half an hour, but we have already taken more than almost an hour of his precious time. So thank you very much, Daniel, for joining us today. And I must say that your answers and your insights were enlightening for all of us. And we look forward to hosting you more often at Osana's Foundation, and also inviting you to India for our annual Maharana Pratap annual geopolitics dialogue. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you so much. I look forward to it, and your questions were great. I really appreciated it. Thanks to all of you for a very good conversation.
Thank you. And thanks all the participants for joining us today, and the